force older than language, older than thought itself. It pulls planets into orbit, holds galaxies together across unimaginable distance. It's so familiar, you feel it every second of your life. Yet so strange, we still don't fully understand what it actually is. For all of human history, it remained invisible, unexplained. Then one man, alone in a quiet English garden, asked a question no one else had thought to ask. And in that single moment of simple, almost childlike curiosity, Isaac Newton tamed gravity. He changed everything we thought we knew about the universe. I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but I cannot understand the madness of men. These were the words of Sir Isaac Newton, the man who gave us the laws of motion, universal gravitation, and calculus. The father of modern science. Yet the same mind that unlocked the universe lost a fortune in one of history's greatest financial bubbles. He could predict the paths of planets, but not the frenzy of his fellow humans. This is not another biography. This is the science behind the genius, and the darkness behind the science. Welcome to Dark Science Mind. Imagine a brain so powerful, it could invent an entirely new branch of mathematics in isolation. A mind that saw the invisible forces binding the cosmos, yet was tormented by paranoia, obsession, and secrets he took to his grave. Tonight, we go inside the psychology and neuroscience of Isaac Newton, history's greatest scientist, and examine the hidden darkness that biographies have long ignored. The genius brain. To understand Newton, we must first understand his extraordinary brain. Born prematurely on Christmas Day, 1642, tiny enough to fit in a quart mug, young Isaac was not expected to survive. But something inside that fragile body was wired differently. Modern neuroscientists point to extreme systemizing cognition, the ability to detect, analyze, and manipulate complex patterns. Newton exhibited this at the highest level. During the plague years of 1665 to 1666, while Cambridge was closed and he was isolated at his family home, he developed calculus, conducted groundbreaking optics experiments, and laid the foundations for his theory of gravity, all before the age of 25. This period of hyper-focused isolation reveals a brain capable of intense, sustained attention, a trait linked to high cognitive control and elevated activity in the prefrontal cortex and parietal networks. He didn't just think, he simulated reality in his mind with terrifying precision. His prism experiments showed an almost superhuman sensitivity to light and color. Some researchers speculate he may have experienced elements of synesthesia or heightened sensory processing, allowing him to perceive subtle variations in the spectrum that others missed. He built the first practical reflecting telescope because his brain demanded better tools to test what his mind already understood. Newton's mathematical intuition bordered on the supernatural. He generalized the binomial theorem and created the method of fluxions, what we now call calculus, years before anyone else. His brain operated like a high-precision supercomputer, capable of holding and manipulating abstract concepts most humans cannot even visualize. The dark psychology. But genius always comes at a cost. Newton's early life was marked by profound abandonment. His father died before he was born. His mother remarried when he was 3 and left him with his grandmother. In his private list of sins as a young man, he wrote, "Threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them." This trauma appears to have wired his brain for hypervigilance and emotional detachment. He formed almost no close friendships. He avoided eye contact. He was known for explosive rages when his work was challenged. Clinical psychologists today recognize many of these traits as consistent with neurodivergence. possibly high-functioning autism, combined with obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Newton exhibited rigid routines, extreme perfectionism, and an almost pathological need for control. In 1693, he suffered what historians call a nervous breakdown, months of insomnia, paranoia, and memory loss. He accused friends of plotting against him. Some researchers believe chronic mercury poisoning from decades of alchemy experiments contributed to these neurological symptoms. The very experiments that fed his obsessive search for hidden truths may have slowly poisoned his brain. The hidden darkness. While the world knew Newton the physicist, he spent enormous stretches of his private life as Newton the alchemist and Newton the heretic. When historians later cataloged his personal library, 1,752 identified books, the single largest category wasn't mathematics and it wasn't physics. It was theology. More than a quarter of everything he owned. Alchemy made up roughly another tenth of his collection, more books than he owned on physics outright. The man who invented calculus spent more of his reading life on scripture and the occult than he ever did on science. And his theological position wasn't just unusual, it was genuinely dangerous. Privately, Newton rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, heresy in 17th century England, of a kind that could have ended his career, and possibly far worse. He spent years building a case, using historical and textual analysis, arguing that the biblical passages used to support the Trinity were later corruptions, never part of the original text at all. He wrote it all down in detail. And then he hid it. The manuscript wasn't published until 1785, almost 60 years after Newton was already dead and safely beyond anyone's reach. As warden and later master of the Royal Mint, Newton turned that same obsessive precision toward a very different kind of target. Counterfeiters. He estimated that as many as 1 in 5 coins moving through England's currency at the time was fake. So he disguised himself, gathered evidence himself in bars and taverns, and personally led more than 100 cross-examinations of witnesses and suspects in under 2 years. He successfully prosecuted 28 counterfeiters. Some of them were hanged. The same mind that mapped the heavens also sent men to the gallows over the purity of England's gold. The discoveries that changed everything, but before the secrecy, before the gallows, before the manuscripts he hid from the world, there was the work itself. And it's worth pausing here, because it's easy to lose track of just how much one mind actually produced. In 1687, Newton published the Principia Mathematica, still considered, by most historians of science, one of the most important books ever written. In it, he laid out his 3 laws of motion: the law of inertia, the law connecting force, mass, and acceleration, and the law of action and reaction. The same 3 laws still taught in every introductory physics class on the planet, more than 300 years later. In that same work, Newton formulated the law of universal gravitation, the idea that every object with mass pulls on every other object with mass, all governed by a single equation. It was the first time in human history anyone had proven that the force pulling an apple to the ground and the force holding the moon in its orbit were the exact same force, obeying the exact same law. Separately, working almost entirely alone, Newton developed calculus, a mathematical language for describing change itself. How fast something moves, how quickly it accelerates, how curves and areas behave under transformation. The German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz developed calculus independently at almost the same time, and the 2 men spent years afterward locked in a bitter, very public dispute over who deserved credit. Today, historians generally credit both men as independent co-discoverers, not one stealing from the other, as Newton himself insisted during his lifetime. In optics, Newton proved, using nothing but glass prisms and his own modified eyesight. That white light is not pure, but a combination of every visible color. He published the work in 1704 in a book called Optics. And to build better instruments to test his own ideas, he designed the first practical reflecting telescope, a design whose core principle is still used in observatories and even in space telescopes today. He also served as president of the Royal Society for more than 20 years, shaping the direction of British science during one of the most important periods in its history. By any reasonable measure, this is one of the largest single bodies of foundational scientific work ever produced by one human being. And all of it came from the same mind we've just spent this entire episode taking apart. The abandonment, the secrecy, the obsession, the mercury slowly accumulating in his blood. That's the paradox sitting at the center of Isaac Newton. The damage and the discovery were never two separate stories. They were the same story. The madness of men. In 1720, Newton, by now one of the most famous men in England, invested in the South Sea Company, one of history's most infamous speculative bubbles. Stock in the company soared on promises of exclusive trade rights with South America. Stock in the company soared on promises of exclusive trade rights with South America, swept up an entire country in a wave of financial mania, and then collapsed catastrophically within months. Newton lost at least £10,000, quite possibly more than 20,000. In today's money, that's well over £4 million. Gone. This was the same man who had already solved the orbits of planets, the pull of gravity, the trajectory of comets, and he could not see a market crash coming, even while he was standing inside it. But here's the detail most retellings conveniently skip, because it ruins the dramatic ending. Newton did not die poor. When he died in 1727, his estate was still valued at roughly £30,000, nearly £1 billion, measured as a share of the entire country's economy at that time. The genius who got burned by a stock bubble still died one of the wealthiest men in England. So what's the real story here? It isn't genius loses everything. It's something stranger and more unsettling than that. Newton spent his entire life proving that the universe runs on fixed, knowable, mathematical laws. Gravity, motion, orbits, predictable every single time with no exceptions. Then a stock bubble taught him the one system in existence that doesn't follow any law at all. Human beings. The final obsessions. Even at the very end, Newton's mind never rested. In his final years, he kept working, obsessively, on two unfinished projects: a deeper, more mathematically precise chronology of ancient biblical history, and his anti-Trinitarian theology, the same heretical writing he'd been hiding his entire adult life, still being expanded right up until the end. Most of it stayed sealed for centuries. It wasn't until the 20th century that the economist John Maynard Keynes acquired a collection of Newton's private manuscripts and had them properly studied, finally revealing in Newton's own hand exactly how far his secret beliefs had gone. And here's a strange final detail. Newton, a man so obsessively organized that his own personal book indexes looked like a modern filing system, died without a will. Intestate, the most controlled mind of his century, left his own affairs completely unresolved when he died. Near the end of his life, when someone asked Newton to reflect on everything he'd achieved, the laws of motion, gravity, calculus, optics, a body of work that had permanently changed how humanity understood reality itself, he didn't claim victory. He said he felt like a boy playing on the seashore, every now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the one before, while the great ocean of truth lay completely undiscovered in front of him. Isaac Newton spent 84 years convinced he had barely scratched the surface of what there was to know. He was the most brilliant man of his century, and he died believing he never found the ocean. Closing, Isaac Newton proved that the laws of nature are knowable. The laws of his own mind and the minds of the people around him stayed far harder to solve. He calculated the motions of heavenly bodies with perfect precision. The madness of men, and quite possibly the darkness inside himself, stayed forever beyond his grasp. This is the science behind the genius. This is the darkness behind the science. If you want more episodes examining the hidden minds of history's greatest thinkers, subscribe and hit the bell. Next time, we go even deeper. Until then, stay curious and stay in the light, because the darkness is where the real discoveries hide.